Hello and welcome. My name is Delta, my pronouns are Viva, Vis, and you're listening to Outcast. As I am recording this, International Asexuality Day is coming up, so I thought I would finally do an Ace 101 episode where I go over a lot of the terms you might come across in ace communities and discussions about asexuality. So let's get into it. Asexuality is generally defined as experiencing little to no sexual attraction. Personally, I like to view it as a bit broader and not exclusively defined by sexual attraction, because some people just don't use the concept of attraction. So it might also just be any sexual feelings towards other people an asexual person would experience little to none of. And asexuality is an umbrella term, and it's sometimes also called the Asexual Spectrum, which is more explicitly inclusive. Allosexual. Allosexual is described as someone who experiences sexual attraction in a quote-unquote normal way, and again with other identities on the asexual spectrum that I will also get into in this episode. Defining this solely based on attraction doesn't really make sense, because otherwise some of these aspec identities that I recognize as being aspec, they may be allo, but they're not, because they share experiences with us. But I will get into the whole problem with orientation and attraction in another episode. Demisexual. Demisexuality describes when someone only has sexual feelings towards someone after developing an emotional bond with them. So this means someone is basically asexual unless they develop an emotional bond with someone, and that emotional bond does not have to be romantic. For some people, they feel sexually towards their friends, or this does not have to be romantic, and there's other emotional bonds anyway. Grey sexual. Grey sexuality describes when someone only experiences sexual feelings towards other people under certain circumstances, or very rarely or very weakly. It's basically an umbrella term for all the grey area that's not strictly asexual, but also definitely not allosexual. Phrasexual. Phrasexual is sometimes considered to be the opposite of demisexual. So it means you experience sexual feelings towards people, like in a quote-unquote normal amount, but once you get emotionally close to people, these feelings will fade. Lithosexual. Lithosexual describes someone who may feel sexually towards other people, but once it is reciprocated, either those feelings will fade, or they just dislike the idea of it being reciprocated. Reciprosexual. This describes someone who doesn't feel sexually towards people and will only develop these feelings if someone else feels them first. They can only reciprocate those feelings and not really initiate them in that sense. Bellisexual. Bellisexual describes someone who has little to no sexual feelings towards other people and is not interested in sexual relationships, but may still be interested in some sexual interactions. Orchid sexual. Orchid sexual describes someone who does feel sexually towards other people, but has no interest in acting on this or in any sort of sexual relationships. And this is a prime example of how someone can be sexually attracted to people, but still fall on the asexual spectrum. Presexual. This describes people who only feel sexually towards other people after already having other feelings towards them, such as sensual or platonic or romantic feelings. Quasexual. Quasexual describes people who are unsure whether they feel sexually towards other people, who are unsure what kind of feelings they have for people and can't really tell them apart. For example, they don't know whether they experience sexual or sensual feelings towards other people. Or it can also mean people who just find the concept of sexuality or sexual feelings inapplicable to them. The split attraction model. The split attraction model is very commonly used by asexuals, I would say, and this describes splitting up, so to say, one's attraction into different types of attraction, such as sexual, romantic, platonic, sensual, alterous, and other attractions. Because a lot of people who are both allosexual and alloromantic don't do this. For example, someone who is bisexual probably uses this term to describe all of their physical and emotional attractions towards people, and they don't differentiate between the two. And in asexual communities, it's very common for someone to identify as, for example, asexual aromantic, or asexual demiromantic, asexual homoromantic, just someone who has two or even more labels for their orientation, for different aspects of it. Sex favorable. Sex favorable describes anyone, but it's very commonly used by asexual people, who is interested in having sex with other people. Sex indifferent describes someone who doesn't care whether they do or don't have sex with other people. Sex averse describes someone who's kind of disgusted by the idea of having sex with other people. And sex repulsed describes someone who is repulsed by the idea of sex in general, even when people just talk about it or by depictions in films and other media. Sex ambivalent describes someone who identifies with two of those. For example, someone can be sex indifferent and sex favorable at the same time, or kind of be fluid between them. Ace flux. Ace flux describes someone whose sexual feelings fluctuate in intensity. For example, someone can be asexual sometimes and then they are grey sexual another time, and sometimes they might even be allosexual, but most of the time they are probably on the asexual spectrum still. A spike. This describes someone who normally feels little to no sexual attraction, but sometimes has spikes of attraction. Mere sexual. This describes someone who has several aspec identities. For example, someone who is both demisexual and grey sexual. This can either be because they are fluid between them, or they just have more labels. Cupiosexual. Cupiosexuality describes someone who is on the asexual spectrum, but still desires a sexual relationship. Sexual attraction. Sexual attraction is often defined as a sexual desire that has a specific target. And sexual desire would be just wanting to have sex. So sexual attraction would be, I want to have sex with this person specifically because they find them hot or whatever. I don't understand this. Aroace describes someone who is both on the aromantic and the asexual spectrum, or strictly aromantic and strictly asexual. Alloace describes someone who is alloromantic and asexual, and asmid describes someone who is strictly asexual and somewhere on the aromantic spectrum without being strictly aromantic. And this is all the terms that I see commonly used in ace communities. I hope you have learned something. Happy International Asexuality Day. And that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode or even the entire podcast, why don't you share it with a friend or on social media? Also, please give me a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That would really help me out. You can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/out_castpod. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at out_castpod. You can also send me a voice message if you want to be featured on this podcast. The link for that will be in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.